I didn't raise my voice when they stole my workshop, I just measured the doors. The smell of burnt steel still lingers in my memory, sharp and metallic, the kind that sticks to the back of your throat long after the torch cools down. 3 days earlier, I stood on my own property, boots crunching over gravel that used to sound like home, staring at a laminated HOA notice zip-tied to my gate like it belonged there. Community use authorization, it said, bold letters, official stamp, the kind of paper designed to make you feel small before you even read the fine print. My name wasn't on it. My signature wasn't on it. But somehow, according to Karen Mitchell, president of Willow Creek HOA, my 1,200 square foot workshop was now a shared neighborhood resource. I could still hear the hum of my old MIG welder inside, that low electric buzz I'd spent years perfecting, only now it wasn't mine to control. Through the dusty window, I saw strangers, people I'd never met, handling my tools like they were checking out equipment at a hardware store. One guy laughed as he flipped the switch on my drill press, like it was a toy. Another leaned against my workbench, the same bench I built with my dad 12 years ago, leaving a coffee ring on the surface I'd sanded smooth by hand. And Karen, she stood in the middle of it all, clipboard in hand, smiling like she'd just opened a boutique. Her perfume cut through the air even from 20 feet away, something expensive trying to cover something rotten underneath. "We're improving community value, Mason," she told me, voice sweet enough to sound like a favor. "You weren't using it to its full potential." I didn't answer. My jaw tightened, but my hands stayed still. Because I've learned something working with steel for 20 years, heat applied too fast warps everything. Precision takes patience. I stepped back, let the moment burn into my memory. The way the hinges sat on the frame. The thickness of the door. The clearance between the latch and the jamb, about half an inch, maybe a little less. Details matter. That night, I didn't call a lawyer. Didn't argue. Didn't post online. I sat in my truck with the engine off, listening to the ticking of hot metal cooling under the hood, and I wrote down measurements. Door height, 7 feet. Frame width, 36 inches. Steel gauge, standard commercial, easy to fuse if you know where to apply heat. I watched their schedule, too. Tuesday nights, 7 p.m., HOA board meetings, always inside the workshop now, because apparently my building had better acoustics. Funny how that works. By the second day, they'd put up a new sign over my entrance. Willow Creek Maker Space. Clean lettering. Fresh paint. My old nameplate. Gone. Like I'd never been there. That's when I booked the flight. One way. Austin to Honolulu. Departure at 6:10 p.m. Tuesday. Boarding right when their meeting would be getting started. I packed light, just a carry-on and a quiet mind. The morning of the flight, I walked back onto my property one last time. The air was still, heavy with humidity and the faint scent of oil and sawdust drifting out through the cracks. Inside, they were setting up folding chairs, laughing, planning, acting like ownership was something you could declare on paper and make real. I ran my hand along the outer wall, felt the rough texture of the siding under my fingertips. Solid. Reliable. Mine. I looked at the doors again, the same ones I'd installed myself, reinforced with steel plates after a break-in years back. Strong doors. But strength isn't just about what something can keep out. Sometimes, it's about what it can keep in. I checked my watch. 5:42 p.m. time was lining up perfectly. Karen's voice echoed faintly from inside, confident, in control, already talking about future upgrades, membership fees, expansion plans. She had no idea. Not about the measurements. Not about the timing. Not about the fact that I wasn't fighting her the way she expected. Because while she was busy taking something that wasn't hers, I was making sure she wouldn't be able to walk away from it so easily. And as I turned toward my truck, keys cold in my palm, I realized something that almost made me smile: she didn't steal my workshop. She walked right into it. I did not rush the job, because rushing is how you leave weak points, and weak points are how people like Karen slip through cracks. They do not deserve. The late afternoon sun baked the metal siding of my workshop until it radiated heat like a stovetop, and when I pressed my palm against it, I could feel the energy stored inside, quiet and waiting. Inside, chairs scraped across concrete, voices overlapped, and that same fake laughter echoed like they had already rewritten the history of the place. I walked the perimeter slowly, boots dragging just enough gravel to blend with the ambient noise, counting steps out of habit, mapping angles in my head the way I always do before a job. The hinges were standard steel, exposed, which meant I did not need to break anything, just seal it properly. The back service door had a slight warp near the bottom, about a 1/4-inch gap, nothing serious, but enough to tell me how the frame would react under heat. I had installed those doors myself, reinforced them after a storm ripped through 5 years ago, and I remembered exactly how they were anchored. That is the thing about building something with your own hands, you do not just remember what it looks like, you remember how it behaves. I popped the truck bed and pulled out the welder, the same machine they had been using like it was public property, its handle worn smooth from years of my grip. The extension cable snaked across the ground, and when I plugged it into the external outlet, the faint hum started up again, low and steady, like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been borrowed too long. My watch read 6:27 p.m. Their meeting would be in full swing by now, Karen probably standing at the front, pointing at some printed agenda, talking about budgets and improvements like she had earned the right to either. I struck the first arc, and the world narrowed instantly. Bright white light flared against the seam of the front door, the metal hissed, and the smell hit me, sharp, familiar, honest. Molten steel flowed into the joint, filling space that used to allow movement, turning flexibility into permanence. I moved methodically, bead by bead, not fast, not slow, just precise. Each weld was a decision, each line a commitment. Inside, I could hear muffled voices shifting, maybe someone noticing the change in light through the cracks, maybe someone pausing mid-sentence. I did not listen for words, only for rhythm. There is always a moment when people sense something is off but cannot explain it yet. That moment is everything. I circled to the side entrance, repeated the process, sealing the latch, reinforcing the frame, making sure nothing could give without serious effort. No damage, no destruction, just a change in state. Open to closed. Accessible to contained. By the time I reached the back door, the sky had turned that deep orange that sits low over Texas in the summer, and sweat ran down my neck, stinging where it met the heat rising off the metal. My hands stayed steady. Always steady. The final weld cooled with a soft ticking sound, tiny contractions as the metal settled into its new shape. I stepped back and looked at the building, really looked at it, not as a place that had been taken, but as something that had just been reset. My watch read 6:58 p.m. Boarding would start in less than 20 minutes. Inside, the noise had changed. Louder now. Less organized. Chairs moving again, footsteps, the kind of sounds people make when they realize the room is not behaving the way it should. I unplugged the welder, coiled the cable, and loaded everything back into the truck with the same care I used every day. No rush. No panic. Just procedure. As I closed the tailgate, I caught a glimpse of the new sign they had mounted above the door, clean and bright against the fading light. I left it there. Let them keep their name on it a little longer. The engine turned over with a low rumble, and as I pulled away, the workshop shrank in the rearview mirror, a solid shape against the horizon, holding everything exactly where it needed to be. I did not lock them in. I simply finished the job they started the moment they decided it was theirs. The airport smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee, a sterile contrast to the hot steel and dust I had left behind less than an hour ago. I sat at gate 18, boarding pass in my hand, the thin paper slightly damp from the sweat that had not fully dried on my palms. Around me, people scrolled on their phones, laughed quietly. Complained about delays, completely unaware that 1,200 square feet of community property was having a very different kind of evening back in Texas. My phone buzzed once, then again, then it did not stop. I did not need to look to know who it was. Unknown numbers. Local numbers. One labeled Karen Mitchell that I had never saved. The vibration rattled against the metal armrest in a steady rhythm, almost like the welder earlier, only this time it carried panic instead of control. I let it ring. Across the terminal, a television mounted above the bar flickered through local news headlines, muted captions crawling across the bottom of the screen. Nothing about me. Not yet. I leaned back in the plastic seat and closed my eyes for a second, replaying the last sounds I had heard before driving away. The shift in tone. The confusion. The first realization that something was not right. It always starts small, a door that does not open the way it should, a handle that feels different in your hand. Then the second try. Then the third. Then the silence between attempts gets shorter, tighter. That is when people start to understand they are not in control anymore. My phone lit up again, this time a voicemail notification stacking on top of the others. I opened it, not to listen, just to read the transcription. Words jumbled together, sentences cut off, but the message was clear enough. You need to come back right now, this is illegal, we are calling the fire department. I almost smiled at that. They were finally using the right words. Illegal. Emergency. Authority. The same language they had tried to use against me, now turning back on them. A gate agent's voice came over the speaker, calm and practiced, announcing pre-boarding for families with small children. The normal rhythm of travel continued, completely detached from the shift that had already been set in motion miles away. I stood up, slung my bag over my shoulder, and glanced down at my phone one more time. A new notification pushed through the others, this one from a neighbor 2 lots down, a guy named Rick who minded his own business and kept his grass exactly 2 inches like the HOA loved. Fire trucks just rolled in, the message read. Whole street lit up. What did you do? I typed nothing back. I did not need to. The answer was already unfolding in real time. I could picture it clearly without being there. Red lights washing over the siding of my workshop, reflective stripes bouncing off the steel doors that no longer moved. Officials walking up, trying the handle, then the other one, then stepping back, assessing, asking questions. Karen's voice cutting through the noise, louder now, less polished, explaining, insisting, trying to reframe the situation into something she could still control. But there are rules that sit above HOA bylaws, above printed notices and neighborhood authority. Safety codes. Occupancy laws. Emergency access requirements. The kind of regulations that do not care about your title or your clipboard. The kind that carry real consequences when ignored. Boarding Group B was called, and the line began to move. I stepped forward with it, the slow shuffle of travelers inching toward the jet bridge. My phone buzzed again, this time a photo message. I opened it as I scanned my ticket. The image was grainy, taken from across the street, but clear enough. My workshop stood under flashing lights, officials clustered near the entrance, and right there in the center of it all, Karen, her posture stiff, her smile gone, her world shrinking to the size of a problem she could not write her way out of. I slipped the phone into my pocket and walked down the narrow corridor toward the plane, the hum of the engines growing louder with each step. As I crossed the threshold and felt the shift in air pressure, I realized something simple and absolute. I had not taken anything from them. I had not broken anything. I had not even raised my voice. I had just made sure that for once, they had to deal with the full weight of the space they decided to occupy. And this time, there was no way for them to step outside of it. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane pushed back from the gate, a low mechanical hum building beneath my feet, steady and controlled, nothing like the chaos unfolding back home. I buckled in, the seatbelt clicking into place with a finality that felt familiar, like the last weld cooling into a solid line. A flight attendant moved down the aisle, calm voice, routine instructions, the kind of order people trust because it rarely changes. My phone was still in airplane mode, but the last image Rick sent burned clear in my head: red lights, reflective jackets, a crowd forming where there used to be quiet. I knew how those scenes worked. First responders do not care about who claims ownership on paper. They care about access, safety, code compliance. A sealed structure with people inside triggers a chain of procedures that no homeowners association can override with a laminated notice. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, picturing the sequence as if I were still there, because in a way, I was. The knock on the door that would not open. The second attempt, louder. A step back, radios crackling, someone calling it in. Questions fired at the nearest person with authority, which in Karen's world meant her, but in that moment meant nothing. Her answers would come out fast, controlled at first, then strained as the situation refused to fit her narrative. She would say it was a community space, that everything was authorized, that there must be some kind of misunderstanding. But the doors would still be sealed. The hinges would still be fused. The simple fact would remain that a group of people were inside a structure without proper exit access, and that is the kind of problem that brings in inspectors, reports, and a very different level of attention. The plane began to taxi, tires rolling over the runway with a rhythmic thump that matched the steady pulse in my chest. I opened my eyes and looked out the window, runway lights stretching into the distance like a line I had already crossed. Somewhere behind me, a passenger complained about a delayed connection, another laughed at something on a screen, life moving forward in small, ordinary ways. Back in Texas, nothing about that evening would feel ordinary anymore. The smell inside my workshop would have changed, less like oil and steel, more like tension and confusion, the air heavier with every passing minute. Someone would try to stay calm, to organize, to suggest waiting it out. Someone else would start to question how they ended up in that position at all. And Karen, she would still try to hold it together, voice firm, posture straight, because that is what people like her do when control starts to slip. They double down. They speak louder. They repeat the same lines as if volume can replace authority. But authority does not come from a clipboard when real officials are standing in front of you asking why a building is not compliant with basic safety standards. The engines roared to life, a surge of power pressing me back into the seat as the plane accelerated. The force was clean, predictable, built on systems that worked because they followed rules that could not be bent. That contrast settled in my mind, the difference between systems designed to protect and systems designed to control. Karen had spent years operating in the second kind, where intimidation and paperwork could shape outcomes. Tonight, she had stepped into the first kind without realizing it. And those systems do not negotiate with attitude. They respond to facts. The plane lifted, wheels leaving the ground, and the city lights below began to scatter into a glowing grid, each block shrinking into something manageable, distant. I exhaled slowly, feeling the shift as gravity loosened its grip. Up here, everything looked calm, almost simple. Down there, the process was just beginning. Reports would be written. Statements taken. Questions asked about authorization, permits, liability. Names would be recorded, including hers, tied directly to decisions that could not be explained away with a smile. And somewhere in that chain of events, the truth would settle into place, clear and unavoidable. I had not taken anything from them. I had not even needed to be there. I just set the conditions and let the system do what it was designed to do. As the plane leveled off and the seatbelt sign chimed off, I realized the real weight of it was not in the steel I had fused or the doors that would not open. It was in the fact that for once, the rules they tried to twist were now the same rules holding them accountable, and there was no clause, no vote, no meeting that could undo that. The cabin had settled into that quiet mid-flight rhythm, the kind where the only sounds are the low drone of engines and the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups, but my mind was still running through everything happening on the ground with mechanical precision. At 32,000 feet, distance does something strange to perspective. it strips away emotion and leaves only structure, cause and effect, action and response. I knew by now the fire department would have done their initial assessment, confirmed the lack of accessible exits, and escalated the situation beyond anything the HOA could label as a misunderstanding. That meant documentation, official reports, and more importantly, jurisdiction shifting out of Karen's hands entirely. I reached into the seat pocket and pulled out the in-flight magazine, not to read it, just to have something physical in my hands while my thoughts stayed locked on the sequence unfolding below. Rick's last message replayed in my head, the way he described the street lit up, neighbors gathering at a distance, that mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction people get when someone who pushed too far finally meets resistance. He had lived under Karen's rules for years, like everyone else, trimming hedges to exact measurements, repainting fences over shades that only existed in HOA documents. Tonight, those same people were watching a different kind of enforcement take place, one that did not involve warning letters or monthly fines. My phone remained silent now, locked in airplane mode, but I could almost feel the stack of messages building, each one carrying more urgency than the last. Karen would not have stopped calling after the first unanswered attempt. She would escalate, contact anyone she thought could help, maybe even try to reach local officials she had leaned on before. But this was not a zoning dispute or a landscaping violation. This was a safety issue tied to occupancy, and that category operates on a different level entirely. I imagined the moment when an inspector stepped forward, clipboard in hand, not her clipboard, a real one backed by state code, and started asking direct questions. Who authorized the use of this building? Who is the registered owner? Where are the permits for this change in function? Simple questions, but each one cutting through layers of assumption that Karen had built her authority on. And when those answers did not align, because they could not, the focus would shift from inconvenience to liability. That word carries weight. Liability means responsibility, and responsibility means consequences that do not disappear with a board vote. The flight attendant rolled a cart down the aisle, offering drinks with a practiced smile, and I took a cup of water, the cold condensation grounding me for a second in the present. I sipped it slowly, feeling the dryness in my throat ease, while my thoughts stayed anchored to the structure I had set in motion. I had not needed to raise my voice or make a scene, because systems like the one now surrounding my workshop do not respond to volume, they respond to conditions. And I had created a condition that demanded attention. Below, Karen's narrative would be collapsing piece by piece. The idea that the workshop was community property would not hold up under a single property record check. The claim of authorized use would fall apart without permits or consent. And the moment officials realized people had been gathered inside a structure that did not meet basic access requirements, the situation would move into territory she had never controlled. I leaned back again, eyes half closed, picturing the look on her face when that shift became clear. Not anger at first, but disbelief. The kind that comes when someone who has always operated within a certain boundary suddenly finds themselves outside of it with no map. That is where control ends. The engines maintained their steady hum, carrying me further away mile by mile, but in reality, everything important was already happening without me. That was the part most people would not understand. They expect confrontation, arguments, some dramatic moment where everything explodes. But real change, real consequences, they tend to arrive quietly, built on decisions made long before anyone notices. By the time the effects are visible, it is already too late to reverse them. Somewhere on the ground, under flashing lights and official voices, Karen was learning that difference in real time. And for the first time since she decided my workshop was hers to take, she was no longer the one setting the rules. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight stretch, the world outside my window had turned into a black sheet broken only by distant clusters of light far below, and somewhere in that darkness, my workshop sat under a very different kind of illumination. I could almost trace the timeline without seeing it. The first phase would already be over by now. Access attempts failed. Initial assessment completed. Situation escalated. That meant the next step was no longer about getting people out, because that would have been handled under supervision, controlled, documented. The focus would have shifted to why it happened in the first place. And that is where everything Karen built her authority on started to collapse in slow motion. I imagined the clipboard changing hands, from fire response to inspection, from immediate safety to structural and legal review. Different tone. Different questions. Less urgency in voice, more weight in words. Someone asking for ownership records. Someone else checking permits. The kind of quiet coordination that does not look dramatic but carries more consequence than any argument ever could. Back in my seat, I adjusted slightly, the fabric rough against my arm, and let out a slow breath. The air inside the plane was cool, controlled, filtered, the opposite of the thick tension that would still be hanging around my property. People would be talking now, not just officials, but neighbors. Word spreads fast in places like that, faster than any official report. Phones out. Photos taken. Messages sent. By morning, everyone within a 5-mile radius would know something had gone very wrong at the place Karen claimed as her latest community improvement. And once a story like that starts moving, it does not stay contained. It grows. It changes shape. It picks up details. Some accurate, some exaggerated, but all pointing in the same direction. That something she controlled slipped beyond her reach. My mind drifted to the paperwork that would follow, because that is where the real weight settles. Incident reports. Code violations. Statements. Each one a piece of record that does not disappear. Each one tying decisions back to a name. Her name. Not as a title on a neighborhood newsletter, but as a responsible party in a situation that should never have existed in the first place. That is the difference most people miss. Authority inside a small system feels absolute until it meets a larger one that does not recognize it. And when that happens, everything has to be justified, not assumed. The seatbelt sign flickered on briefly as the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a quick drop that made a few passengers gasp before everything stabilized again. I barely moved. Sudden shifts do not bother me. I have worked with materials that react far worse under stress. Metal expands, contracts, warps if you do not understand how to guide it. People are not much different. Karen had spent years applying pressure outward, shaping her environment to match her expectations. Tonight, the pressure came back inward, and she did not know how to handle it. I pictured her standing there, no longer centered, no longer composed, trying to answer questions that did not bend around her authority. Trying to explain decisions that sounded reasonable in a board meeting but completely different under official review. That is where the cracks form. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just small inconsistencies that spread until the whole structure no longer holds. A flight attendant passed by, checking on passengers with a quiet nod, and I realized how little effort it had taken on my end to set all of this in motion. No confrontation. No escalation. Just observation, timing, and understanding how systems respond when pushed in the right way. I had not forced anything. I had simply removed the illusion that they were operating without consequence. Down below, the process would continue through the night. More questions. More documentation. More realization that this was not a situation they could vote their way out of. And somewhere in that sequence, the moment would arrive when Karen fully understood that the space she claimed, the authority she exercised, and the rules she enforced were never actually hers to control in the first place. By then, I would be halfway across the ocean, the distance stretching wider with every mile, while the reality she created for herself settled in with no easy exit. The moment the plane leveled into cruise, something shifted in my chest, not relief, not satisfaction, just a clean, quiet certainty that everything below was now out of my hands in the best possible way. I did not need to see it anymore to know how it was unfolding. Systems like that move in layers, and by now, the first layer of confusion had already burned off, leaving only structure behind. Someone official would have taken control of the scene, not loudly, not dramatically, just with presence. Radios clipped to shoulders, measured voices, procedures followed step by step. And Karen, for the first time in years, would not be the one directing anything. She would be standing slightly off-center, trying to insert herself into a process that did not recognize her authority. I could picture the way she would adjust her posture, straighten her shoulders, hold on to that practiced tone, the one she used in meetings when she needed to sound decisive. But there is a difference between sounding in control and actually having it, and people trained to enforce real regulations can hear that difference immediately. They do not respond to tone. They respond to facts. I imagine the questions getting sharper, more specific, less patient. Who authorized occupancy? Where is the documentation? Who owns this structure? Simple, direct, impossible to redirect. And every answer she gave would lead back to the same gap, the same missing piece she never thought she needed because no one had challenged her before on that level. The cabin lights dimmed further, and most passengers had settled into sleep or quiet distraction, but I stayed awake, staring out into the dark where nothing moved except the faint reflection of my own face in the window. Back on the ground, the scene would have changed again. The initial crowd of neighbors would have thinned, replaced by a smaller group watching from a distance, phones still out, still recording, because moments like that do not happen often in places built on routine and control. Someone would post a video. Someone else would share it. By morning, it would not just be a local situation anymore. It would be a story. And stories have a way of reaching people who ask different questions, who look at things not as isolated incidents but as patterns. I shifted slightly in my seat, the pressure in my lower back reminding me how long the flight still was, and let my thoughts settle on what comes after the scene clears. That is where the real impact sits. Not in the flashing lights or the raised voices, but in the paperwork that follows them. Reports filed. Violations noted. Follow-up inspections scheduled. Each step building a record that does not fade with time. Karen had built her influence on repetition, on enforcing small rules consistently until people stopped questioning her authority. Now that same repetition would work in reverse. Every documented detail reinforcing the fact that she had overstepped, that she had acted outside any legitimate boundary. And once that pattern is established in an official context, it does not go away because someone insists it was a misunderstanding. I could almost hear the tone of the conversation shifting hours after the scene ended, when officials stepped aside and spoke among themselves, comparing notes, connecting details. That is when decisions start forming, not announced, not finalized, but set in motion. The kind that lead to notices, hearings, consequences that arrive days or weeks later but trace directly back to that moment. I had seen that process before, in different contexts, different systems, but the structure is always the same. You do not need force to create change. You need alignment. Conditions that make the system respond the way it was designed to. And once that response starts, it does not require your presence to continue. The engines droned steadily, carrying me farther from Texas with every passing second, but distance did not dilute the clarity of what I had done. I had not trapped anyone. I had not taken anything. I had simply removed the assumption that they could operate without consequence. And in doing that, I had shifted everything. Somewhere down there, under a sky I could no longer see, Karen was still trying to regain footing, still trying to frame the situation in a way that gave her control. But control built on assumption does not survive contact with reality. It fractures, quietly at first, then completely. And once that fracture runs through the system, there is no way to weld it back the way it was. By the time the first hint of dawn brushed the horizon outside my window, a thin line of pale blue cutting through the darkness, I knew the night back home had already turned into something permanent. Not loud, not chaotic, just permanent. The kind of shift that settles into records, into conversations, into the way people look at a name after everything changes. The cabin lights slowly brightened, easing passengers out of sleep, and the quiet murmur of movement returned, seatbelts clicking, trays folding, the soft rustle of jackets being pulled on. Routine. Predictable. Controlled. The exact opposite of what Karen had been dealing with for the last several hours. I reached for my phone but did not turn it on yet. I did not need updates to understand the trajectory. By now, the scene would be cleared, the officials gone, but the aftermath would still be in motion. Temporary barriers, maybe. Notices placed where everyone could see them. That clean, official paper that carries more weight than any HOA letter ever printed. The kind that does not ask for compliance but demands it. I pictured my workshop again, not as it was taken from me, not even as it stood during the night under flashing lights, but as it would look now. Quiet. Closed. Still holding the shape I gave it. The welds cooled and settled, not dramatic, not destructive, just firm. Final. And around it, the air would feel different. Not just for Karen, but for everyone who had watched her operate without challenge for so long. People notice when authority cracks. Even the smallest fracture changes how they respond. Conversations shift. Questions start forming where silence used to sit. That is how control unravels. Not all at once, but in small, steady pieces. The plane began its descent, a gentle drop that pressed slightly against my chest, and I finally powered on my phone. It lit up instantly, notifications stacking faster than I could read them, messages from unknown numbers, neighbors, even a few names I recognized from past HOA meetings. I did not open most of them. I did not need every detail. I only needed one clear signal of where things had landed. I scrolled until I found Rick's name again. His message sat there, sent hours ago but still sharp in its simplicity. They shut it down. Officials posted violations. Karen is not in charge anymore. I read it twice, not because I doubted it, but because of how clean it sounded. No extra words. No confusion. Just a statement of fact. That is how real consequences read when they settle in. I leaned back in my seat as the ground came into view, patches of green and coastline stretching under the morning light, and for the first time since I left, I let myself feel something close to release. Not victory. Not satisfaction. Just alignment. The kind that comes when everything lands exactly where it should have been all along. Karen had spent years building a system where she controlled access, controlled perception, controlled outcomes. But she built it on assumptions that no one would push back in a way she could not manage. That no one would understand the difference between her authority and actual authority. That no one would take the time to set conditions instead of reacting to pressure. She was wrong about all of that. And now, she was standing in the middle of a structure she no longer controlled, surrounded by rules she could not rewrite. The wheels touched down with a firm, steady contact, rubber meeting runway in a controlled burst of friction, and as the plane slowed, I looked out at a place that had nothing to do with what I left behind. New air. New ground. Distance in every direction. But the real distance was not measured in miles. It was measured in control. I had stepped out of a situation that tried to define itself around me and let it collapse under its own weight. I gathered my bag, stood up with the rest of the passengers, and moved toward the exit with the same steady pace I had kept from the beginning. No rush. No hesitation. Because the job had already been done long before I ever left the ground. The air hit different the moment I stepped out of the airport, warm, humid, carrying the faint scent of salt and jet fuel, a clean break from everything I had left behind, and for a few seconds, I just stood there, letting it settle, letting the silence replace the constant hum of engines and the quiet calculations that had been running in my head for days. Hawaii does that to you. It slows everything down whether you want it to or not. But even as I grabbed a cab and watched palm trees blur past the window, my phone kept lighting up in my hand, notifications stacking faster than before, the story catching traction now that the dust had settled. I did not rush to open them. Timing matters, even after the work is done. When I finally unlocked the screen, the first thing I saw was not a message, but a screenshot. Someone had taken a photo of an official notice posted directly on my workshop door, bright white paper against dark steel, stamped and signed. Structure closed due to safety violations. Unauthorized occupancy under investigation. Clean language. No emotion. No room for interpretation. Below it, a second notice referenced a review of property rights and unauthorized use. That one mattered more than anything Karen had ever printed. I zoomed in slightly, reading the lines again, not because I needed confirmation, but because I understood what came next. Investigations do not stop at doors. They move outward, tracing decisions, following paper trails, connecting names to actions. Karen's name would be all over that chain. Not as a title. As a responsible party. The cab slowed at a red light, and I glanced out at the ocean in the distance, sunlight reflecting off the surface in sharp flashes, and for the first time since this started, the weight of it all shifted completely off my shoulders. Back in Texas, the narrative had flipped. Neighbors who used to keep their heads down were now talking openly, questioning everything that had been enforced without challenge. Rick sent another message, this one shorter, almost like he did not need to say much anymore. Board meeting cancelled. They are calling for a vote to remove her. I read it once and set the phone down on my lap. That was the final piece. Not the notices. Not the officials. The shift in the people around her. Because authority like hers only works when everyone agrees to it, even silently. The moment that agreement breaks, everything else follows. I checked into the hotel, the lobby cool and quiet, nothing like the charged air back home, and as I stepped into my room, I set my bag down and walked straight to the balcony. The ocean stretched out in front of me, endless, steady, moving on its own rhythm without needing permission.